Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This video is on Eckhart Tolles' book, A New Earth, Chapter 2, Ego, the Current State of Humanity. During this video, I will be reading quotes directly from the book and also from my notes. And I want to emphasize that this is my own personal interpretation of Eckhart Tolles' writings. Please feel free to leave a comment, and I promise to personally review all of the comments, but I have to apologize ahead of time. I will not be able to personally respond to all of the comments. I also highly suggest that you get your own copy of Eckhart Tolles' A New Earth book and follow along and make your own notes so you'll get the most out of the writings. Okay, so let's get started. Chapter 2, Ego, the Current State of Humanity. Eckhart Tolle begins Chapter 2 of A New Earth by discussing the importance of not labeling things because at first glance, you're only seeing the surface layer of something which is only the tip of the iceberg of its reality. Eckhart Tolle also discusses how we and everything on the planet is interconnected, and the source of all life and all things is God. All right, now I'm going to read a quote from page 26. Even a stone, and more easily a flower or a bird, could show you the way back to God, to the source, to yourself. Eckhart Tolle continues to tackle the topics of the ego, unity consciousness, and the illusionistic physical plane that we exist in. He continues Chapter 2 by writing specifically about the mental and physical illusions that we fall prey to as we navigate this physical existence on Earth. Then now I want to read a quote from page 26 again. When you don't cover up the world with words and labels, a sense of the miraculous returns to your life that was lost a long time ago when humanity, instead of using thought, became possessed by thought. A depth returns to your life. Things regain their newness, their freshness, and the greatest miracle is the experiencing of your essential self as prior to any words, thoughts, mental labels, and images. For this to happen, you need to disentangle your sense of I, of beingness, from all the things it has become mixed up with, that is to say, identified with. That disentanglement is what this book is about. Eckhart Tolle continues to tackle the topics of ego, unity consciousness, and the illusionistic physical plane that we exist in. He continues Chapter 2 by writing specifically about the mental and physical illusions that we fall prey to as we navigate this physical existence on Earth. The quicker you are in attaching verbal or mental labels to things, people, or situations, the more shallow and lifeless your reality becomes, and the more deadened you become to reality, the miracle of life that continuously unfolds within and around you. In this way, cleverness may be gained, but wisdom is lost, and so are joy, love, creativity, and aliveness. They are concealed in the still gap between the perception and the interpretation. Of course, we have to use words and thoughts. They have their own beauty, but do we need to become imprisoned in them? By stating this, Eckhart Tolle emphasizes his point of how by putting a label or word attachment to something limits it and reduces it to something that the human mind can safely comprehend. Eckhart Tolle continues Chapter 2 with a section titled The Illusory Self. He begins this section by discussing how the word I simultaneously embodies the greatest error and the deepest truth, depending on how it's used. In normal everyday usage, I embodies the primordial error, a misperception of who you are, an illusory sense of identity. This is the ego. The illusory sense of self is what Albert Einstein, who had deep insights not only into the reality of space and time, but also into human nature, referred to as an optical illusion of consciousness. That illusory self then becomes the basis for all further interpretations, or rather misinterpretations of reality. All thought processes, interactions, and relationships. Your reality becomes a reflection of the original illusions. The good news is, if you can recognize illusion as illusion, it dissolves. The recognition of illusion is also its ending. Its survival depends on your mistaking it for reality. Eckhart Tolle continues the section by elaborating on what the nature of the illusory self is. What you usually refer to when you say I is not who you are. By a monstrous act of reductionism, the infinite depth of who you are is confused with the sound produced by the vocal cords or thought of I in your mind, and whatever the I has identified with. So what do the usual I and the related me, my, or mine refer to? The author continues by explaining how we have been conditioned by this mindset since we were children, and how we were incorrectly taught to identify with objects as a part of us or a part of our being. And so, as the child grows up, the original I thought attracts other thoughts to itself. It becomes identified with a gender, possessions, the sense-perceived body, a nationality, race, religion, profession. Other things the I identifies with are roles, mother, father, husband, wife, and so on, accumulated knowledge or opinions, likes, dislikes, and also things that happened to me in the past, the memory of which are thoughts that further define my sense of self as me and my story. These are only some of the things people derive their sense of identity from. They are ultimately no more than thoughts held together precariously by the fact that they are all invested with a sense of self. This mental construct is what you normally refer to when you say I. To be more precise, most of the time, it is not you who speaks when you say or think I, but some aspect of that mental construct, the egoic self. Once you awaken, you still use the word I, but it will come from a much deeper place within yourself. Some people never forget the first time they disidentified from their thoughts, and thus briefly experienced the shift in identity from being the content of their mind to being the awareness in the background. For others, it happens in such a subtle way, they hardly notice it, or they just notice an influx of joy or inner peace without knowing the reason. Eckhart Tolle continues to point out how most people are still completely identified with the incessant stream of mind chatter, of compulsive thinking, most of it repetitive and pointless. This is the meaning of being spiritually unconscious. And this is the perfect segue to the author's next section titled, The Voice in the Head. The author begins this section by illustrating an experience that he had when he was a student at the University of London. He would take the tube or the subway regularly, and he observed a woman behaving crazily, talking out loud in an angry, abusive manner. He followed the woman one day and was shocked to discover that they were going to the same place and that she was a student or an employee at the university that he attended. Eckhart Tolle was shocked that this insane person would have some place in the institution that he regarded so highly. Later that day, he continued to ponder the woman from the subway. And he writes, I was still thinking about her when I was in the men's room prior to entering the library. As I was washing my hands, I thought, I hope I don't end up like her. The man next to me looked briefly in my direction, and I suddenly was shocked when I realized that I hadn't just thought those words, but I mumbled them out loud. Oh my God, I'm already like her, I thought. Wasn't my mind as incessantly active as hers? There were only minor differences between us. The predominantly underlying emotion between her thinking seemed to be anger. In my case, it was mostly anxiety. She thought out loud. I thought mostly in my head. If she were mad, then everyone was mad, including myself. There were differences in degrees only. Eckhart Tolle describes how this epiphany moment in the restroom at the University of London was his first shift in consciousness, or shift into awareness. His realization that life isn't as serious as my mind makes it out to be was only a glimpse of joy, quickly to be forgotten, as he would spend the next 3 years in anxiety and depression, completely identified with his mind. I had to get close to suicide before awareness returned, and then it was much more than a glimpse. I became free of compulsive thinking and of the false mind-made I. The incident with the woman on the subway was the first seed of doubt planted into the author's mind as to the absolute validity of the human intellect. The tragic suicide of an admired professor was another shocking event that caused Eckhart Tolle to examine the cultivation of thought, the ego and how it works, our consciousness, and how to detect it within oneself. In the next section titled Content and the Structure of the Ego, Eckhart Tolle explains how the egoic mind is completely conditioned by the past. Its conditioning is twofold. It consists of content and structure. The content you identify with is conditioned by your environment, your upbringing, and surrounding culture. Whether the child is poor, whether the toy is a piece of wood shaped like an animal, or a sophisticated electronic gadget makes no difference as far as the suffering caused by its loss is concerned. The reason why such acute suffering occurs is concealed in the word my, and it is structural. The unconscious compulsion to enhance one's identity through association with an object is built into the very structure of the egoic mind. One of the basic mind structures through which the ego comes into existence is identification. One of the most basic levels of identification is with things. My toy later becomes my car, my house, my clothes, and so on. I try to find myself in things, but never quite make it and end up losing myself in them. That is the fate of the ego. Do you like how dramatic I am? Eckhart Tolle continues his discussion with a section titled Identification with Things. In this section, the author discusses how what kind of things a person identifies with varies depending on their age, gender, income, culture, and etc. Eckhart Tolle elaborates on this by explaining how the advertising industry markets their products as identity enhancers in order to sell you a product that you don't really need. How companies use the image of certain celebrities to create false association in potential consumers' minds, and how overpriced designer labels give the illusion of exclusivity. And now I want to read a quote from page 36. What you identify with is all to do with content, whereas the unconscious compulsion to identify is structural. It is one of the most basic ways in which the egoic mind operates. Paradoxically, what keeps the so-called consumer society going is the fact that trying to find yourself through things doesn't work. The ego satisfaction is short-lived, and so you keep looking for more, you keep buying, and you keep consuming. Eckhart Tolle goes on to further explain how in this physical dimension that we currently exist in, things are necessary. We need homes, vehicles, and clothes in addition to the things that we value because of their beauty. Eckhart Tolle explains how we must honor the world of material form and how it's impossible to do this if we use things as a means to self-enhancement. Ego identification with things creates attachment to and obsession with things. A large part of many people's lives are consumed by an obsessive preoccupation with things. Now I want to read a quote from page 38. As a spiritual practice, I suggest that you investigate your relationship with the world of things through self-observation, and in particular, things that are designated with the word my. You need to be alert and honest to find out, for example, whether your sense of self-worth is bound up with things you possess. Do certain things induce a subtle feeling of importance or superiority? Does the lack of them make you feel inferior to others who have more than you do? Do you casually mention things or show them off to increase your sense of self-worth in someone else's eyes or through them in your own? Do you feel resentful or angry and somehow diminished in your own sense of self when someone else has more than you do or when you lose a prized possession? The next section of chapter 2 is titled The Lost Ring. In this section, Tolle recalls a story of a woman that he would visit during his time as a counselor and spiritual teacher. The woman had cancer throughout her body, and her doctors had given her only a few months to live. Eckhart Tolle would sit with her, holding space, speaking very little. One day he arrived to find her very upset. The woman claimed that her grandmother's diamond ring had been stolen. Eckhart Tolle observed that she was in an egoic, reactive state. So he said, I'm going to ask you a few questions, but instead of answering them now, see if you can find the answers within you. I will pause briefly after each question. When an answer comes, it may not necessarily come in the form of words. She said she was ready to listen, and I asked, do you realize that you will have to let go of the ring at some point, perhaps quite soon? How much more time do you need before you will be ready to let go of it? Will you become less when you let go of it? Has who you are become diminished by the loss? There were a few minutes of silence after the last question. When she started speaking again, there was a smile on her face, and she seemed at peace. The last question made me realize something important. First, I went to my mind for an answer, and my mind said, yes, of course, you have been diminished. Then I asked myself the question again, has who I am become diminished? This time I tried to feel rather than think the answer, and suddenly I could feel my I amness. I have never felt that before. If I can feel the I am so strongly, then who I am hasn't been diminished at all. I can still feel it now. Something peaceful but very alive. That is the joy of being, Eckhart Tolle said. You can only feel it when you get out of your head. Being must be felt. It cannot be thought. Eckhart Tolle was able to help the woman realize that her identification with the diamond ring was her ego and not really her or her inner being or her I am presence. The woman later said to Eckhart Tolle, now I understand something that Jesus said that never made sense to me before. If someone takes your shirt, let him have your coat as well. That's right, Eckhart Tolle responded. It doesn't mean you should never lock your door. All it means is that sometimes letting things go is an act of far greater power than defending or hanging on. Life will give you whatever experience is most helpful for the evolution of your consciousness. How do you know this is the experience you need? Because this is the experience that you are having at this moment. The author concludes this section by explaining that it is not wrong to be proud of your possessions or to have a desire for a possession, but when you desire an object because it enhances your identity, or an egoic, more than you mindset is the intention, then that is when you need to recognize that your ego is running the show. The next section of Chapter 2 is titled The Illusion of Ownership. In this section, the author discusses what it really means to own something. Eckhart Tolle explains how the idea of ownership, or possession of a person, place, or thing, is just an illusionistic story that we tell ourselves and other people. We never, in reality, ever own anything at all. Many people don't realize until they are on their deathbed and everything external falls away that no thing ever had anything to do with who they really are. In the last moments of their life, they then also realize that while they were looking throughout their lives for a more complete sense of self, what they were really looking for, their being, had actually always been there, but had been largely obscured by their identification with things, which ultimately means identification with their mind. Eckhart Tolle goes on to quote Jesus and explain the true meaning behind his teachings. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," Jesus said, "for theirs will be the kingdom of heaven." What does poor in spirit mean? No inner baggage, no identifications, not with things, nor with any mental concepts that have a sense of self in them. And what is the kingdom of heaven? The simple but profound joy of being. That is where you let go of identifications and so become poor in spirit. That's beautiful. Eckhart Tolle goes on to expand his discussion by contending that anti-consumerism and anti-private ownership are only other forms of egoic mindsets. People who view themselves as one who has transcended interest in material possessions and therefore views themselves as superior is still under control of their ego. Only the thought form has changed. Eckhart Tolle explains how we have a fictional idea of the permanence of ownership and of material objects, and how they provide the egoic mind with a false sense of solidity and permanence. The author goes on to describe the idea of land ownership as absurd. The idea of paying money to a business or a government entity in exchange for a piece of paper that states that the land is yours is just an illusionistic idea created by the ego. Sorry, Japan. Okay, I'm going to read a quote from page 45. "The ego tends to equate having with being. I have, therefore I am. And the more I have, the more I am. The ego lives through comparison. How you are seen by others turns into how you see yourself. If everyone lived in a mansion or everyone was wealthy, your mansion or your wealth would no longer serve to enhance your sense of self. The ego's sense of self-worth is in most cases bound up with the worth you have in the eyes of others. You need others to give you a sense of self. And if you live in a culture that to a large extent equates self-worth with how much and what you have, if you cannot look through this collective delusion, you will be condemned to chasing after things for the rest of your life in the vain hope of finding your worth and completion of your sense of self there." Eckhart Tolle concludes this section by explaining how you can let go of your attachment to things simply by becoming aware of the egoic attachment. I am the awareness that is aware that there is attachment. That is the beginning of the transformation of consciousness. In the next section of Chapter 2, Eckhart Tolle continues on with the illusionistic idea of ownership by examining the state of wanting and the need for more. In this section, the author explains how once you obtain a material object, the ego's satisfaction is short-lived and quickly moves on to wanting something else. This idea stems from the ego's association with fear of incompleteness or fear of not having enough. Don't have enough yet equates to the egoic mind as I am not enough yet. Now I want to read a quote from page 46. Since you cannot find yourself through having, however, there is another, more powerful drive underneath it that pertains to the structure of the ego, the need for more, which we could also call wanting. No ego can last for long without the need for more. Therefore, wanting keeps the ego alive much more than having. The ego wants to want more than it wants to have. And so the shallow satisfaction of having is always replaced by more wanting. This is the psychological need for more. That is to say, more things to identify with. It is an addictive need, not an authentic one. The author uses bulimia as a specific example of how the egoic wanting can manifest psychologically in such a twisted, manipulative way. And I want to read a quote from page 47. The sufferers of bulimia will often make themselves vomit so they can continue eating. Their mind is hungry, not their body. This eating disorder would become healed if the sufferers, instead of being identified with their mind, could get in touch with their body and so feel the true needs of the body rather than the pseudo needs of the egoic mind. Okay, at this time, I just want to take a moment to address the subject of this eating disorder and bulimia and anorexia. I don't want to just quickly pass over this point. I have known several people throughout my life, male and female, that I saw how they were tortured physically, emotionally, and psychologically and spiritually by these diseases and how it ravaged them on every level. If you are suffering from bulimia or anorexia, or you have a loved one that is suffering from an eating disorder, I want to lovingly tell you that you are not alone. There is nothing wrong or bad about you, and that there is help, assistance, and healing for you. You have the ability to heal and transcend this ravaging disease. I've included in the description box links to the bulimia help, resources, and website, so you can please get the professional help that you need. Eckhart Tolle continues his explanation of wanting. Wanting is structural, so no amount of content can provide lasting fulfillment as long as that mental structure remains in place. Intense wanting that has no specific object can often be found in the still developing ego of teenagers, some of whom are in a permanent state of negativity and dissatisfaction. I just think that's funny. It's funny. The thought forms of me and mine, of more than, of I want, I need, I must have, and of not enough, pertain not to content, but to the structure of the ego. The content is interchangeable. As long as you don't recognize those thought forms within yourself, as long as they remain unconscious, you will believe in what they say. You will be condemned to acting out those unconscious thoughts, condemned to seeking and not finding, because when those thought forms operate, no possession, place, person, or condition will ever satisfy you. No content will satisfy you as long as the egoic structure remains in place. No matter what you have or get, you won't be happy. You will always be looking for something else that promises greater fulfillment, that promises to make your incomplete sense of self complete and fill that sense of lack you feel within. In short, once you become aware of the egoic wanting thought patterns that you have in whatever form they appear in, you break free from the illusionistic attachment to form. In the next section of this chapter, titled Identification with the Body, Eckhart Tolle first discusses how we centrally identify with our gender and physical appearance. Identification with gender is encouraged at an early age, and it forces you into a role, into conditioned patterns of behavior that affect all aspects of your life, not just sexuality. It is a role many people become completely trapped in. Life's fulfillment is perceived to be fulfillment of one's gender identity, and the physical appearance of the body that contributes greatly to the sense of who you think you are, its strength or weakness, its perceived beauty or ugliness relative to others. For many people, their sense of self-worth is intimately bound up in their physical strength, good looks, fitness, and external appearance. Many feel a diminished sense of self-worth because they perceive their body as ugly or imperfect. The author continues to explain how the mental image or concept of one's body can become so distorted by egoic thought processes. People who suffer from anorexia see only the mental concept of their bodies and exist in a state of fear, only seeing the image of, I am fat or I will become fat. And now I want to read a quote from page 50. Those who are identified with their good looks, physical strength, or abilities experience suffering when those attributes begin to fade and disappear, as of course they will. Their very identity that was based on them is then threatened with collapse. In either case, ugly or beautiful people derive a significant part of their identity, be it negative or positive, from their body. To be more precise, they derive their identity from the I thought that they erroneously attach to the mental image or concept of their body, which after all is no more than a physical form that shares the destiny of all forms, impermanence and ultimately decay. Eckhart Tolle goes on to argue that it's important to appreciate and care for our physical bodies, but inevitably it will age or change in other ways, and we need to maintain a healthy mindset. If you don't equate the body with who you are, when beauty fades, vigor diminishes, or the body becomes incapacitated, this will not affect your sense of self-worth or identity in any way. In fact, as the body begins to weaken, the formless dimension, the light of consciousness, can shine more easily through the fading form. The author goes on to address the opposite end of the spectrum when people have problems with their bodies and they identify as a constant sufferer. Amazingly, but not infrequently, the ego, in search of a stronger identity, can and does create illnesses in order to strengthen itself through them. In the next section of Chapter 2, Eckhart Tolle discusses feeling the inner body. He explains that the body identification is easily transcended through a practice called inner body awareness. The author explains how the practice of sitting still and silently, beginning with just a few minutes, to focus on the feeling of energy going through your hands and feet, will eventually, through practice, create a global sense of aliveness, and states that when you are in touch with your inner body, you are not egoically identified with your physical outer body. Now I'm going to read a quote from page 53. What I call the inner body isn't really the body anymore, but life energy, the bridge between form and formlessness. Make it a habit to feel the inner body as often as you can. After a while, you won't need to close your eyes anymore to feel it. For example, if you can feel the inner body whenever you listen to someone, it almost seems like a paradox. When you are in touch with the inner body, you are not identified with your body anymore, nor are you identified with your mind. This is to say, you are no longer identified with the form, but moving away from form identification toward formlessness. which we also may call being. It is your essence identity. Body awareness not only anchors you in the present moment, it is a doorway out of the prison that is the ego. It also strengthens the immune system and the body's ability to heal itself. Eckhart Tolle continues chapter 2 by discussing one's forgetfulness of being. The author describes thoughts as forms and states that thoughts are energy and do possess forms. Thoughts are forms that are less dense than physical matter, but nevertheless, thoughts do possess an energetic form. For those of you who follow Abraham Hicks, this is exactly what they mean when they say thoughts become things. Abraham Hicks. Eckhart Tolle continues to expand on the topic of thought forms by explaining how egoic thought patterns become a stream of incessant chatter in your mind, and how one becomes so identified with the stream of negative self-talk that you believe and think that it is you, and you are so identified with the thought form that you are in the grip of the ego. Now I want to read a quote from page 54. Ego is the conglomeration of recurring thought forms and conditioned mental emotional patterns that are invested with the sense of I, a sense of self. Ego arises when your sense of beingness, of I am, which is the formless consciousness, gets mixed up with form. This is the meaning of identification. This is the forgetfulness of being, the primary error, the illusion of absolute separateness that turns reality into a nightmare. Eckhart Tolle poignantly discusses two famous philosophers' statements about thought form. The 17th century philosopher Descartes famously stated, "I think, therefore I am." However, a modern-day philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, argues by stating, "The consciousness that says I am is not the consciousness that thinks." What did he mean by that? When you are aware that you are thinking, that awareness is not part of thinking. It is a different dimension of consciousness. And it is that awareness that says I am. In short, the chattering talk in your head is a different dimension of consciousness than your inner being or your soul. It's your ego, and it is not you. The author describes individuals who are so identified with the egoic thought patterns in their head that they live like sleepwalkers, trapped in old, dysfunctional mindsets that continuously recreates a nightmarish reality. The implication of Sartre's insight is profound, but he himself was still too identified with thinking to realize the full significance of what he had discovered, an emerging new dimension of consciousness. Eckhart Tolle concludes chapter 2 with a section titled "The Peace That Passes All Understanding." In this section, the author illustrates how people experience awakening or shifts into an expanded consciousness after a tragic loss of some kind. Once you realize what the ego is and how it works, when forms that you had identified with that gave you your sense of self collapse or are taken away, it can lead to a collapse of the ego. Since ego is identification with form, when there is nothing to identify with anymore, who are you? When forms around you die or death approaches, your sense of beingness, of I am, is freed from its entanglement with form. Spirit is released from its imprisonment in matter. You realize your essential identity as formless, as an all-pervasive presence of being prior to all forms, all identifications. You realize your true identity as consciousness itself, rather than what consciousness has identified with. That's the peace of God. The ultimate truth of who you are is not I am this or I am that, but I am. Well, everyone, this concludes my video on Chapter 2 of Eckhart Tolles' A New Earth. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe. And stay tuned for the next video on Chapter 3, The Core of the Ego. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video.